I'm going to record on this computer. I've had some trouble gaining access to our YouTube channel that the Google account has. So I need to play around and talk to John about the password because it's asking me to click on the phone that it's okay to sign on. I might just put it up on my own YouTube channel, and then I can link it to the Facebook and share it that way, and share it via email so everyone can see the previous meetings. So it is October, so of course I have my Halloween themed stuff going on. So we'll see that more when it comes to our identification challenges. Welcome everyone. It's nice to see a good percent of the club. Hope everyone's been super well and enjoying some migratory activity. The birds have seemed to be rather birdy lately and active and doing some interesting things, at least on campus and around the area. I was at Deer Park today. There's a lot of bird activity going about. So we'll do as we always do and start with some bird sightings. We'll have identification challenges. We'll talk and welcome any new members that might be here. So if you are here, get ready for a nice welcome. We'll talk any committee business and then have our discussion if there's any points there, and enjoy a exciting talk this evening. So opening up the floor for anyone who's had any bird sightings, feel free to unmute yourself, or you can use the chat where I monitor and I can speak for you, but it'll be nice to hear what everyone's been up to and what they've been seeing.
Good evening. Hey, this is Mark Sopko. I was able to see an American golden plover up at Bethel Beach over in Matthews County, and that was a life lister for me. I think Harry and Rochelle Colstock also saw it. It was in with a bunch of blackberry belly plovers, so it was kind of neat to see migrating through.
Thank you for the tip, Mark.
Yeah, well, you can thank Fred Atwood because he was the first to see it. And, you know, I got one of those eBird alerts, rare bird alerts. I was going to run errands and I saw that on my email, and I turned around and went to Bethel Beach. So it was kind of cool.
Well, not as exotic, but I heard a yellow-bellied sapsucker in my yard today. So that's the first I've heard.
That's interesting, Bill, because when I was at Deer Park, I was with students and I kept telling them there was a squirrel that was yelling, and it turned out to be a yellow-bellied sapsucker because I was thinking it was a bit early and just default wanted to squirrel. And they're like, that looks like a bird. So I lost street cred with my students because I don't know a squirrel from a bird, but.
Yeah, that's terrible.
I had a house first the other day of these really high tides pretty much flooded all of the wetland at our place on the Eastern Shore. And I had two Sora swimming to find upland out there right behind the house, which was a first out there. So that was an interesting migrant for me on the Eastern Shore.
And a really good house bird.
Yeah, when you've got high marsh behind the house, things are on the table.
Anyone else? Don't be shy.
So this week, I've had ovenbird visiting my backyard all week, feeding off the feeder of all things. So it's kind of nice, unusual. Black-throated blues and northern parulas coming through, and palm warblers showing up. Yellow rumps, of course, are all over the place right now.
Anyone else? I think Dave's winning with so many awesome birds. Okay, so let's move on to our Halloween challenge to see what the things are. They're not meant to be difficult. Right now, it's kind of more tongue-in-cheek with the spooky season. And so you can use your chat or yell it out. Hopefully we're all thinking about a murder when we're looking at this.
Raven.
Yep. So Mark gave us the American crow. So in fact, it is an American crow. I know I picked a weird angle to try to throw you guys off. The next
real-
one,
The real question I'd ask is it American crow? And then listen to see if it actually sounds, because we get fish crows out.
yep. And then because I took the picture, I knew it was American crow because it was calling. These were in a parking lot in Miami that were just really close trying to get food. So it made a nice photo opportunity. So the next image, I'm going to be a little bit unkind to you. Yep, so that's a
Yeah, I agree
raven.
with Mark.
Raven.
It's a raven. And if we weren't aware, a group of ravens is called an unkindness. So I was trying to be punny. Most of you know I despise puns, but it was my attempt to be clever. And this,
They do now breed in Richmond. So I know there's been a couple that have shown up in Newport News recently, and that's probably why.
that's pretty
Must
awesome.
have known Edgar Allan Poe was born there. I lived there.
Hey, Sean, it's Bill. Is it an American raven or common raven?
Probably a common raven, and then I copied it from the previous slide and just didn't delete
Gotcha.
American crow. So it's common raven.
Thank you.
And then this is, I accidentally put a Chihuahuan raven up there, but I fixed it because they have white feathers under the nape, which you could see when I was in El Paso because the wind would blow, and that's how I got my one photo that you could tell. Another easy one,
Great gray owl.
great gray owl, and I put that because sometimes it's referred to as the ghost of the north. So again, sticking with our spooky Halloween themes. And so then the last two are some more kind of spooky birds.
It's an oil bird.
Yeah, so an oil bird, which if you aren't familiar with, they're pretty awesome. Whoop, don't look at that one. Oil bird from South America, somewhat, I think they make it into Panama, but just a nice nocturnal looking bird that I think kind of has a spooky look. I think a lot of the nocturnal birds, because the eye to head ratio look a little bit spooky, albeit cute at the same time. Then, of course, a really spooky looking picture. P2?
Great Potu, maybe?
Yes. And so this was from something that last December went around the internet pretty hard from someone, I think in Brazil, that had it on a fence post. So another really interesting bird that way. I'm going to play for you the song that I'm stealing from the Cornell Labs sound bank, just so you can see or hear rather how crazy that sound is. Are you all hearing the sound?
Oh, yes. We had a pair of these at the field station in Belize that I worked at. And yeah, that they're crazy sounding.
Yeah, that just, I could imagine early explorers being in the jungles, hearing those things in the evening. That would freak them out. So let's jump to our committees. Gwen, do you want to help me welcome anyone new this evening?
I personally don't know of anyone new. John may have a list. I don't know.
Is there anyone new that's willing to say they're new? If not, that's fine, but we wish you hello. Okay, publicity. I haven't heard anything from Katrina or Mike about. Newsletter, is Tom here? I know Tom will always encourage any articles or pictures. I know some people might do book reviews. There's a lot of books about birds that have been coming out lately, and sharing your bird experience, and always to get things in by the 25th. and remember that bi-monthly, so ours will be coming up soon. Along those lines, we're still trying to do that photo contest. I haven't heard from Mike if anyone sent pictures in, but remember, you can send your pictures for September in to him so we can have a little bit of a photo contest and see the things that you're seeing and also celebrate your ability to take some awesome photographs or capture some awesome species. And then really not doing much with hospitality, but I like to keep a reminder about Jane and Diane always doing things. Of course, Jane leading the wonderful Sunday walks. And webpage, I didn't see the Maxis. Did anyone notice them and I just missed them? Or the Maxis if you're here. Awesome. So webpage is looking good. I think it's being updated and keeping everyone well informed. I've gotten some contacts from people in the community because they saw our webpage about doing some programs and oftentimes just looking for hints about injured wildlife and things like that. But at least the webpage is being seen. For John, I'll remind people, and I actually had to ask my wife if we paid our dues, and she couldn't remember, so she had to look it up. But if John's here, you can say something about club dues. So if not, the slide will suffice. Okay, so our slide will suffice. I would like Dave now to talk about some of the results from last weekend.
Oh, now it's just, sorry, do we move on?
Okay.
Oh,
Are you done, John?
no, I'm done.
Okay. So last Saturday we did the big birding day. It was a little different than last year for a couple of reasons. One, the weather was not as cooperative. It was rainy, windy. The storm surge was pretty tough, so there wasn't a whole lot of beach for a lot of people to find some shorebirds and things. So a month earlier makes a big difference, and the birds that are actually coming through, winter species really hadn't arrived yet. We had, of course, no loons, no siskins, no red-breasted nuthatches, none of those kind of things that white-throated sparrows, none of that stuff was here yet. So it's a little bit different. And it's been a strange year for warblers. You know, they normally would have come through by now. They're starting to trickle through now, but it really didn't get a big push of warblers either. So, and then the effort was a little low. You can see the numbers there, 17 members. The number in parentheses was last fall's numbers. So we had 33 participants last year. So, you know, about half this year. 14 checklists, 93 species. So quite a difference between a month, almost a month earlier. And if you look closer to the bottom, you can see we only had 3 duck species versus 20 last year, and only 4 shorebird species versus 14. So, I mean, right there is a significant difference. And of course, the common birds were well represented. The top 3 were Carolina wren, cardinal, and crow, followed closely by blue jay and chickadee and mourning dove. So, let's see.
Dave, do you recall what the top 3 most common observations were last year?
I think it was pretty similar. I think it was like chickadees, Carolina wren. They were typical backyard birds, though. So, but really nothing unusual. We did have 27 identifications by one team or one couple. So again, lots of individual birds seen. So shows that some people were out there looking, trying to find some stuff, but it was just not an ideal day, and we might want to consider going back to November next year when we can enjoy a lot more of the duck species at least. So if anybody wants the list, they can let me know or shoot me an email, and I'll send them the Excel spreadsheet that I've got with all the species seen.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Thanks for everyone who participated. I forgot about it. I saw a whole bunch. I was leading the Northern Neck's Master Naturalist insect. They had an insect and bird walk. And so I did the birds, someone did the bird, I did the insects, they did birds, but they hardly saw any birds. So everyone luckily turned to the dark side and got excited about insects. So it was a good day for that. Bill, speaking of thinking about ducks and winter and birding, you provided a slide for us.
All right, so this will probably look familiar to most. Just reminding all that the Christmas bird count will be Saturday, December 18th. So if you haven't volunteered already, please do and participate. I'll just note that I don't have anyone for airport yet, airport sector, and only one person for Newport News at this time. So that's where my current shortfalls are. But it's really normally a great day unless the weather's lousy. So hopefully we'll have a nice day and see a lot of stuff and a lot of those ducks.
Great. So I put Bill's contact. I know he keeps giving it out, but make sure you do sign up. The more, the merrier. And those data, as Bill has put on that thing, really do make a big difference. Bill and I are working with some of my students to look at the spring bird counts now that students are back on campus and trying to look for patterns for the same sectors, but for our springtime counts and see what's going on and monitor and just have an idea of how bird populations might have changed. And we're going to put them in a modeling. I have a new hire at HU who's an ecological modeler, and it's going to look at some of the habitat changes, roadways, population densities, and some other things to see if we can contribute some ecological components to the patterns that the club has been seeing for a while. So good job helping out students get research experience, and this nice little partnership Bill was willing to share those data with us for. Now, the upcoming field trip, which I think is next weekend, please someone correct me, I was using the website and I know I made mistakes in the past. So just correct me if I'm wrong. I know it's next weekend. I'm unsure about the time because it said something about 7 and then 7:30. And I said it was, I noticed it was, hey, something was changed. James,
Yeah,
what's the correct time?
Yeah, well, I was going off of our, normal. In the past, what we've done is met at the South Tunnel Island and gone over, but polling the folks at the Hog Island field trip, and we decided to meet at the Eastern Shore of Virginia, at the Visitor Center at 7.
Okay, great.
Instead.
I think the more birding you can get in, the better.
Yeah, so we'll just go ahead and meet over there. And so, yeah, it is next Saturday. My phone number and email are on screen, and, shoot me a text or an email or something, just so I know kind of how many people to expect. I don't want to take off and be expecting a whole bunch more people. So yeah, either one of those is fine to get in touch with me. I've heard from some folks already. So we'll start at the National Wildlife Refuge and go around to a couple of Northampton County, locales that are around that usually produce some things. So
Okay,
I expect
good.
maybe it'll go till, 10 or 11. You always, since you're over there, you always have the option to go up to Chincoteague, should you, or any other places in northern Northampton or Accomack, but we as a group won't.
Yeah, it's a good day. All right, so any other comments for our open discussion? If not, I'm going to ask Bill to introduce our speaker for the evening so we can all learn more about our feathered friends.
Well, I'd be honored to. It's Alicia Garcia this evening, and she is the Natural Resources Manager for Langley Air Force Base. And I'll defer the floor to Alicia.
Hey, give me just 1 minute to get this pulled up. And all right, can you all see that?
Yes.
Great. Oop, well, here's the whole thing in reverse. Okay, all right. So as Bill said, my name is Alicia Garcia. I'm the Natural Resources Program Manager at JBLE-Langley. We used to be known as Langley Air Force Base, but that doesn't exist anymore. We are now Joint Base Langley Eustis Langley. That is a much longer mouthful, and that's why we use a lot of acronyms in the military. Just to give you some perspective, the blue that you see on the screen, that's Fort Eustis. The green is the Air Force Base, and the pink in the middle is a parcel of property we own called Big Bethel Reservoir. That is about an additional 400 and some odd acres, and it's actually some pretty neat stuff out there I'll tell you all about in a little bit. It's a bit more of a close-up. We're right adjacent to NASA Langley Research Center. This is one of the areas that you all do the bird survey with every year. So we have a 30+ year record of bird survey data on this property that I do actually use. So I appreciate all of you in the citizen science that you contribute. A little bit of background on the base. For those of you who participated in the Master Gardeners, the last presentation that they did, I was the speaker for them too. So some of this is going to be repeat. Some of it I've tried to adjust to make it a little bit more bird centric so that it'll be more interesting to you, hopefully. The background of the installation is that parts of the original construction began back in 1918 when they were still trying to figure out how to do flight and militarized flight in the United States. We have 7.2 miles of shoreline along the Back River. We have 695 acres of wetlands. That's about 20% of our land. So wetlands are a huge limitation on what we can do, but they're also protected. We have like high quality marshes back behind our munition storage area. We have 2 federal candidates for listing under the Endangered Species Act. We have both the tricolored bat and the spotted turtle. There are spotted turtles around Bethel Reservoir and on the main base. I've seen them, they're pretty cool. We have 4 state listed animals. Those are primarily bats and then the diamondback terrapin. And we're in the middle of the Eastern Flyway, which is it's a super highway for bird migration. We are also one of the most at-risk DoD installations in the country to loss from climate change. And by that, I mean land loss, mission loss. It's a big challenge for us that we're actively trying to deal with. For the Natural Resources Management Program, there's kind of 2 aspects to it. One really important one is for planning to adapt to climate change. And for dealing with climate change, we have to take both an engineering approach and a natural resources approach so that the future mission won't be limited and cool stuff that we have gets to stick around. We also try to manage for the persistence of native plants and animals, and that's a big part of my day-to-day job. That means that I have to oversee for surveys and inventories of native species that are on our land so I can do accurate consultations when we have a development process coming up. I develop and oversee management plans for sensitive species that we may have on our property so that we don't drive them to further loss through our activities. The DoD is actually has a great track record of bringing back endangered species and as being a bastion for a wealth of diversity because we just have so much land and it doesn't get developed the same way the surrounding communities may. I oversee several projects where we're trying to research the species that we do have on our property so that we can manage them more effectively. I advise the people in the engineering squadron and the base in general how we can prevent conflict between wetlands, native species, endangered species, and still continue our mission. And I prepare consults with other federal agencies when needed for permitting reasons. So I'm not going to go in depth talking about climate change for this meeting, but it is really important because it affects, it affects everybody that lives in Hampton. It affects the military installation. It affects the species that live on that installation because they're being pushed inland due to sea level rise. So I don't know how many of you all have read the 2021 report on climate change that was prepared by the international, I can't remember the full name for the IPCC. It's in the notes on this presentation if Dr. Dash wants to send them to everybody. But it's pretty sad. If you really want to rip your own heart out, it's a good read for that, but it is important information. And it says many of the changes that are coming, many changes due to past and future greenhouse gas emissions are irreversible at this point for centuries to millennia, especially changes in the ocean, ice sheets, and global sea level. So even if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases right now, we're past the point of no return for some of these effects. So we need to plan to deal with them. And by 2035 on Langley in particular, a 20-year storm event, which has a 5% chance of happening in any given year, will have the potential to inundate 40% of the installation. And that includes buildings, that includes our marsh areas, that includes parts of our airfield. The picture over here on the right, that's actually the building where I work at, and Mark Sopko works right next door. That's back in 2003 during Hurricane Isabel. I want to say that particular building took on about 4 feet of water. That could definitely happen again in the future. So we're trying to make sure that the damage that does occur won't be as serious. We're not wasting federal dollars on things that we knew were coming. If you look at the picture on the left here, that is the portions of the base that are in the 100-year floodplain. The 100-year floodplain is the orange, and the 500-year floodplain, the 100-year floodplain is the yellow, and the 500-year floodplain is the orange. So it's pretty much the entire base. It doesn't show some parts of the marshes, but obviously, those are marshes, so they're frequently underwater anyway. The picture on the right shows the amount of permanent inundation we expect by 2035 or within the next, really that's within the next 50 years. And that's permanent standing water from like every day. That's not just, during a big storm. So it's pretty significant. We are trying to plan to deal with it. In 2019, we completed a modeling study to try to figure out, okay, we know the water is coming, but where is it coming? Because in Hampton, we're dealing with groundwater withdrawal, which is causing the land to sink, in addition to isostatic responses. So like a long time ago when the Chesapeake Bay was formed through the impact of like a massive meteor, parts of the land are still rebounding from that and what's called isostatic response, and parts of the land are sinking primarily due to groundwater withdrawal. So like the amount of sinking or rising is not even all over Hampton Road. So we tried to look at where we're sinking at and where the water is coming up at. And you can see the, again, the inundation is shown in that figure on the left. Our model assumes a 20% increase in precipitation due to climate change and continued relative sea level rise based on current trends. And like I said, that's not uniform across Hampton Roads, but it's something we have to plan for. There's a twofold way that we have to deal with this. The first is that we have to, engineer physical structures in order to stop that water. And the second is that we have to have a plan to retreat where we can't stop the ocean. So we're looking at in the long term, putting in 5 sea walls. Those will be built on areas that already have concrete down right now. So we're not talking about taking away wetlands or developing in tidal areas. We're talking about putting up big walls where there's already structures to protect the physical infrastructure that we have. And then also putting in tide gates that can be closed ahead of a storm. That's a bit of the engineering approach. I don't talk about that as much in this presentation. I thought I'd focus more on the natural resources approach. But when we think about the engineering approach to preserve the mission and the physical infrastructure at Langley, you have to consider that Langley is an important part of the local economy. I want to say the last figure I saw said that we contribute more than $4 billion to the local economy. And so it's really important that the base stay there, both because we've already developed that land. It makes more sense to use the land that you've already developed on and that you've already had an impact on than it does to move somewhere else and put in a fresh new base. So we're committed to trying to stay where we are and trying to keep the mission there. But, you know, we have to consider what's coming and the, you know, the fact that sea level rise is an issue that we can't stop. There's also a natural resources approach. So we use natural infrastructure to defend our shoreline. And by that, I mean like shoreline restoration projects. And then we make space for marsh retreat to the extent practical. We can't stop the ocean coming, but we can see where it's coming and where changes are occurring on the ground. And we can back up in order to allow those changes to occur. In order to allow for marsh retreat, we have to remove invasive species like Phragmites. I'm sure you guys are aware that that takes up a lot of edge habitat between true salt marsh and maritime forest. We have to put development in areas where it's strategic, so not areas where we see those changes occurring on the installation. And again, like I said, we have to retreat in some spots. Like if you know that change is happening rapidly in an area, it doesn't make sense to try to develop in that area. So from the, again, like I said, I'm focusing more on the natural resources approach. Like I said, as sea level increases and land sinks due to groundwater withdrawal, a less serious storm can cause a lot more damage. Our marshes are lost and the wetlands are expanding, but diversity is lost. And that happens due to fragmentation. So right here, this is our temporary water program person. Her name is Cecilia. She's great. We were doing some repairs in spring on our nature trail. Our nature trail goes over the salt marsh, and you can see like right here, you know, there's the edge of the wetland and maritime forest. There's this mowed area. There's a cute little snake that we caught. And then there's this hard impervious surface that doesn't allow that marsh to continue to back up. And when you lose diversity, you know, because there's habitat fragmentation, you lose, the ecosystem is less able to adapt to future stresses. So that's something we're trying to prevent. When we're looking at relative sea level rise, other things that we have to consider is that the particular assemblage of species that we have on the installation may change. So we're constantly doing surveys and inventories of native species. What we're seeing as a result of climate change is that new species of shorebirds that we haven't necessarily seen on the base before are being pushed inland. For example, in 2017, we had an entire flock of least tern decide to nest on a tar and pebble roof that was right next to our airfield. It was about 1,000 feet from the center line of the airfield, which is super dangerous for the birds, and it's super dangerous for the aircraft. That roof has been upgraded to a more environmentally efficient material. So instead of it being a tar and pebble roof like it was, that roof leaked a lot, it's been upgraded to a traditional like white top roof that has it reflects a lot of the heat and it doesn't leak. So we haven't had the terns come back, but because they were so close to the airfield, that's probably for the best. As more coastal species are being pushed inland and then also being listed under the Endangered Species Act, because we're losing a lot of our rare coastal birds, we have to know what's on the base and how they're interacting with the base environment so that we can manage them effectively, both to preserve the flight mission and to prevent impacts to those particular species. And then this figure that I have in the picture, I actually pulled this from the Washington Post. The original people that made this particular figure was from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and it just shows how much chronic inundation we expect in the Hampton Roads area by 2100. And you can see all of Langley Air Force Base is underwater pretty routinely, gets flooded like 26 or more times per year by then, if we don't take action now in order to change the way we're building things, change how we're building things, change where we're building things, then also protect our shorelines. So Like I said, one of the big things that we've done on the Air Force Base over the last few years is that we've completed shoreline restoration about along every edge of that 7.2 miles of shoreline that we have, where it's appropriate to do so. Since I started, I've overseen more than, I want to say, 5,000 feet personally of shoreline restoration, and we have done more than 10,800 linear feet of shoreline restoration around the base. And by that, what I mean is that we had like what are called materials of opportunity that were all along the shoreline. So historically, prior to the Clean Water Act, people would take bits of the airfield, bits of roof, bits of chimneys I've seen, and they would dump them on the shoreline thinking that that was going to stop erosion. But instead of stopping erosion, what we would see is that water would rush up, it would go through these uneven pore spaces between the bits of junk and then pull out a lot more material. So the materials of opportunity dumped on the shoreline actually contributed to erosion rather than slowing down. And so we've taken the shoreline restoration approach. You put geotextile down, you put rock over the top of that, and then you backfill with sand and spartina and other plants that can live in that intertidal environment, and you put a breakwater out. It's very effective. It's dramatically reduced flooding in some of the parts of the base, as you can see from these pictures in this slide. And then we're also starting to do stream restoration. So we have several feeder creeks that come from Bethel Reservoir or from like our golf course, for example, where instead of having channelized ditches that dump out into the water, we're trying to actually like put them into a more natural condition. Because, you know, water doesn't like to go in a straight line. It always wants to meander. And so we're putting them back in those more natural conditions to restore fish passage, to prevent flooding, and to cut down on erosion and sedimentation into the back river and the Chesapeake Bay in general. As the natural resources manager, whenever we decide to do one of those projects, I'm heavily involved in reviewing both the design and the permitting of those projects, which means I have to put out public notices. I have to consult with other federal agencies such as NOAA or state agencies like VMRC, the local wetland board for the city of Hampton, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So, you know, they can take a lot of time, but it's really important that we have those conversations. And I get, you know, I have a planning and advisory role. When we're trying to figure out where we're going to develop, we sit down with our engineers and our stakeholders, and we try to come up with development plans for whole parts of the base. And I have to tell you, the engineers, they really listen when I talk to them about, you know, seeing physical signs of wetland development on the ground. We know that those are not places that we should plan to develop. And it weighs heavily into what we do for the next, you know, 10 to 20 years. All right, so getting a little bit more into just general program management, talking about the natural resources and the cool fun stuff. General program management specific to natural resources means that I have to manage the plants and animals we have on the base for persistence. We don't want to lose any of the stuff that we have, even if it's not necessarily a rare or threatened species. We don't want it to become that way. Good sound science is driven by research and evidence. So I have several research projects that I'm overseeing right now that I'm excited about. Again, you know, the advisory services to plan for and prevent conflicts between our mission and natural resources. For example, our flight mission and wildlife that may be on the airfield, it's really important. I run the invasive species management program, and then I'm going to talk to you guys about some extras that we also do that aren't necessarily required, but you know, when you can do better and you can do more, I think it's good to try to do so. So one of the major laws that guides managing for persistence on DoD installations is the Sikes Act. It was originally passed, I want to say, in like 1963, with the intent of opening up military installations for recreation when it was compatible with military missions, and then also for the preservation of rare, threatened, and endangered species. So basically, the Department of Defense sat down with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Department of Interior and decided, hey, to the extent possible, please try not to list military installations as critical habitats for rare, threatened, and endangered species. And in return, we will agree to do everything that we can to manage those species effectively, to work with the Department of Interior, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and NOAA as appropriate to protect those species. And it's worked. It has a great history of success. It served for the protection of more than 300 rare, threatened, and endangered species found in the United States. It's only on only or partially on military lands, and it's helped many populations of vulnerable species to recover. The bald eagle is one success story. I want to say this is the Florida darter. I'm not sure. I've labeled it down in the comments. And then the red cockaded woodpecker. It's found in longleaf pine habitat throughout the Southeast, particularly on lands that are burned routinely. I used to work on Fort Stewart, and we had one of the only recovered populations in the United States, to the extent that we were catching young birds and then taking them to other installations to help those populations recover. In part because the military mission was really compatible with what that particular species needed. Fort Stewart, all of the installation is burned on a 3-year interval, and that frequent burning, it's great for like military maneuver activities because things don't accidentally catch on fire when ordnance or munitions are used. And it's great for a lot of the species that call longleaf pine habitat home, because it keeps that understory open, and it helps a lot of the plants that are fire dependent for germination continue to be there. So Sikes Act, it's great, it works. Part of how we manage for persistence is that we have to do baseline surveys and inventory for the types of species that we have. If we don't know what's there, we can't protect it. So we do baseline surveys for amphibians, for bats, for birds, for plants, for anything that we have a suspicion is on our installation. We're supposed to do those for every 5 to 10 years. On the left is a picture of a tricolored bat. I want to say we caught that guy in 2019 over the summer. That was a really old one. Its teeth were actually starting to get worn down. The tricolor bat is a federal candidate for listing as threatened because of white nose syndrome. White nose syndrome was introduced, I want to say 10 or 15 years ago, and it's taken out about 80% of our native bats, particularly for like the tricolor bat, northern long-eared bat, and Indiana bat. So far, it's mostly on the East Coast, but I know it's past the Mississippi now. And for those naive populations, it's just, wipes them out. And on the right, we have diamondback terrapin. It's considered by the state of Virginia to be near threatened. One of the big pressures on diamondback terrapin used to be that people caught them in droves to make turtle soup. As that has gone out of fashion, our terrapin have popped back, which is great. One of the major threats to them now is both development and then export to China. Believe it or not, a lot of our turtle species are actually caught out of the wild and exported for the foreign Asian food market. I don't really understand that, but it's a point of concern. A lot of our surveys are contracted out. Some of you in this group, I think I saw the coal stalks on here, are familiar with that. And then we also develop management plans. Like once we know we have a rare, threatened, or endangered species, it's not enough to just say, okay, we know that's there, but we have to have a plan like, okay, we know that's there. How are we going to protect it? How are we going to help it recover to the extent that we can? And how are we going to prevent ourselves from having any kind of impacts on them? So basically we have to figure out how are they using our land and what do they need? The northern long-eared bat, which is pictured there because they have longer ears than a lot of the other myota species, is federally listed. We have an abundance of evidence to suggest that they are breeding out at Big Bethel Reservoir. We're still trying to figure that out for sure because many bats that are within the same genus, their calls sound really, really similar. So I've actually got some folks out at Bethel Reservoir doing some netting tonight so we can try to figure out, is this a migratory stopover? What, like, are they breeding during the summer? What are they specifically doing out here? And then the other photos of the eastern black rail, that was recently listed. We have a ton of high quality marsh out on Langley. It's possible that it's there. Very little is known about that species. And I want to say there were few documented populations in Virginia, but we've got to look for it. And if it's there, we'll have to protect it, which is great. So a little bit about some of the research projects that I'm running is that we have a bald eagle management study, we have a marsh size and marsh diversity study, we have the bat land use and migration study I mentioned a moment ago. We're doing snake fungal disease surveys and then also salt marsh skipper research. I'm not necessarily the individual doing all of the research, but I make sure that it can happen on our land. And I help out wherever I can. So I'm going to talk about each of these studies, particularly the bald eagle one, because it's really cool and I've been super involved in it. So bald eagles are fully recovered locally. I'm sure you all have noticed that. There's tons of them. They're everywhere. They've become almost common, which is a great success story. This is a picture of 5 bald eagles that are eating some dead deer at a site that I have over at Bethel Reservoir for trapping. Their breeding success has started to drop locally, according to the Center for Conservation Biology at College of William and Mary. And that indicates that maybe they've hit carrying capacity. So, you know, when a species goes over the number of individuals that the local resources can support, it'll start to drop a little bit. And that's because it's reached carrying capacity. And that's what we're seeing, or what we believe that we're seeing. You know, so they're doing so well. There's no more room for any more of them locally. The population may drop a little bit before it stabilizes. They, particularly the juveniles of the species, they like to hang out and loaf in open fields, including airfields. And at every local municipal airport in the area, Richmond, Norfolk, Newport News, Portsmouth, they have run into one of these guys with a plane. They are so big that depending on the speed of the aircraft, they can go through a window, they can kill a person, they can take out an aircraft engine. That's millions of dollars in damage. So we're trying to figure out how effective are our current scare tactics and what really works with the species to avoid collisions. So in addition to being protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, they're also protected under the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. So all we can really do is we can scare these guys off. Our airfield is about 1.5 kilometers from end to end. So when we shoo a bird away, especially an intelligent bird like an eagle, our suspicion is that they just fly on down to the other end of the airfield, and that doesn't mitigate the risk. So like I said, we're trying to figure out how effective are our current scare tactics and what works to avoid collisions. So in order to do this, we're looking at a couple of different things. One is translocation. So translocation is where you catch an animal, you move it to a different area, and you hope that it never comes back. So we have caught, I want to say to date, 3 different adult bald eagles and moved them to Charlottesville, let them go right along the Rapidan River. I believe I can show you in the next slide. We let them go along river in the daytime so that they can see. And then we look at what they do by putting they're outfitted with a backpack unit that sends a signal to a satellite that we can track it like as quickly as from second to second. And then we're also monitoring their movement response to hazing. So in the picture on this particular slide, it is a couple of researchers and the USDA biologists from the airfield. They caught a juvenile bald eagle, so it had to be removed from the nest before it was old enough to fly, before it was old enough to be shimmying out on branches, and while it was large enough to just kind of be super awkward, and also large enough to be fitted with a leg band. So it's a developmental period of only about a week or so where the bird's big enough to hold that leg band and be outfitted with a patagial tag, and small enough and young enough that it's heavy and awkward. We don't have to worry about it trying to jump out of a nest when we're climbing up there. So it's a real delicate sweet spot. With the juvenile birds, we outfit them with like I said, a patagial tag. It's a radio tracker. It goes through a part of the wing. You have to be really careful to avoid a tendon that's right there. The patagial tag goes through, it can stay on the bird for life. Other birds can't really see it. It goes underneath the feathers. And the hope is that it's less likely to interfere with normal eagle behavior, though we know that we've observed the backpack units that we fit some of the birds with. We've observed eagles outfitted with those backpacks still, breeding and doing all the normal eagle stuff that they do with no problem. But I always assume that if an animal looks different, other animals are going to notice that. And so we want to try to affect it as little as possible, especially when we're trying to study it. So this particular eagle was fitted with a patagial tag. We took some blood samples to try to figure out, what sex is it. We also look at lead levels just as a part of another larger research project, and then stuck it back in the nest. This is data that we have from one of the backpack units from looking at the translocation part. So what we've learned so far is that we can catch a bird, we can take it across the state, and we can let it go. Our assumption was that if a bird really likes the spot because there's abundant food, rich nesting habitat, it knows the area, it's good at hunting there, that it's going to come right back. And so far, the data that we have suggests that's true. You can take them all the way across state and let them go, but they'll be back within about 2 days if they like it there. However, they won't come back to the particular site you trapped them at because they have realized that freaks them out. They don't want to be trapped again. They're never coming back there. We've also confirmed a couple of things that we already suspected, which is that the landfill that's right next to Langley is a big draw for returning eagles, and that Plumtree Island National Wildlife Refuge, which is just across the water from us, is a big attractant to eagles because there's a lot of rich habitat there. So data we have so far, it suggests that translocation prevents an animal from returning, but to the specific location, but not to the general area. So it may not be an effective strategy for getting them off the airfield. For the patagial tags, we have basically a system of nodes on the airfield. It's like a satellite tracking system where the bird is outfitted with the patagial tag that sends out a radio signal. And then we have radio receivers on the airfield that can give us pretty precise movement about what are they doing on the airfield, how are they moving on the airfield, what's their altitude there. So each time we happen to see a bald eagle on the airfield, our USDA folks, they see it, they take some data about where it's located, and then they go over to the eagle and they scare it away. All of that data we were already collecting as part of permits in order to be able to scare eagles away in the first place, because as you will, I'm sure, aware, you can't just go messing with birds without special permission. They're protected. And so far what we have determined is that this particular bird was on, this is a little baby bird. We caught it over in Hampton, fitted it with a patagial tag, and it was on our airfield on the 3rd of August. The data that we have from the USDA indicates that they had a juvenile bird on the airfield, they scared it away, and it was still there 30 minutes later on a different side of the airfield. So it's just like we thought, we're scaring them away, they're smart, they're going to the other side. So it's one thing to suspect a thing and to commonly be able to discuss with other individuals that are doing natural resource or biology work, what you think's happening. It's another thing to have data. So this is the first project where we've actually collected data to say these guys are smart. Bald eagles are particularly resistant to hazing. Scaring them away and translocating them may not be like the way we're doing it now. It might not be the best method. Maybe there's something we can do more effectively later on. Anybody have any questions about the Eagle project before I move on? No? Okay. All right. Another thing that we're looking at is marsh size and marsh diversity. So with sea level rise, we're losing tidal marshes. We're losing them quickly. They cannot retreat as quickly as the ocean is coming up, and that's going to reduce diversity both within the vegetative layer of the marsh, and then I would assume also within the bird diversity within the marsh, because those birds depend on that habitat. So back in, I want to say the 90s, Brian Watts did a study that looked at the reduction in marsh size and how that related to species richness within the marsh bird community. He came back this summer and included Langley as a research site. So our assumption is that, as these habitats get more and more fragmented and sea levels coming up and it's making those marsh habitats smaller and effective size, we're probably losing diversity as a result of that. So I'll be interested to see what the outcome of that is. It's sad, but we need to know. At land use and migration. So until recently, it wasn't well documented that most bat species actually migrate. We know that they went into caves and hibernated over the summer, over the winter, but a lot of information about what they were doing the rest of the year wasn't necessarily out there. So red bats in particular, we're finding out, probably migrate from north to south fairly good distances every year. We don't know how they migrate. We don't know where they migrate. And so we have put up a Motus tower, and we've been catching bats both out at Bethel Reservoir and on several other federal properties in the Hampton Roads area, and then looking at how they're moving through our airspace. To do that, we put up a Motus tower on the base. That's what this picture is. And you can see the data from our Motus tower at that link that's provided. If Dr. Dash wants to send this presentation out to everybody, you're welcome to have it. We also share that data on the Motus website. So we've had Sora move through, we've had a number of cool blackbird species move through. So, it's kind of interesting information that we share with the wider community just simply by having that, tower on our airspace. It's up on a really high location where you can even see the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. So, some good information. For eastern red bats, like I said, we're looking at how are they migrating. For northern long-eared bats, we don't know if their range has expanded or if a lot of the areas where they were already occurring just hadn't been well studied. In the last 10 years, they've been found on Fort Pickett, they've been found on Fort Eustis. I'm pretty sure they're at Bethel Reservoir and Langley. So, what are they doing? Is their range expanding? Are they being identified correctly? And when they're in those more southerly locations now, are they breeding or are they just hanging out and, eating in between seasons? We have some of the same questions for Indiana bats as well. We don't know if their range is expanded or if they've maybe been misidentified. And Dr. Mark Ford, the Ford Lab out of Virginia Tech, is running that research. Like I said, they're out at Bethel right now, hopefully catching a lot of cool bats so that we can understand them and protect them. So we find them on federal land, we are required to develop a management plan and help to preserve them. So I kind of feel like it's a win when we do find them. This last summer, we've been participating in a DoD-wide snake fungal disease survey. So it was first observed, or people first kind of became aware of this particular fungus in the United States back in 2006. The name of the fungus is written there. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it because I will butcher it. The mortality rate within observed infected snakes is 40% within 90 days. And so the DoD has what's called the Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, so DoD PARC. They're a reasonably well-funded research organization that's trying to look at snake populations on DoD lands across the United States and try to figure out what species is this fungus hitting? What's the mortality rate? What's the background prevalence of this infection? Are we just noticing it now? Has it always been around? Is it a new disease that's been brought into the United States, kind of like white nose syndrome for bats? And we have to watch out for our, our native snake populations. What's going on with it? So basically, you catch any snake that you see, you swab it with a cotton swab, you take a look at its body composition, you do some background measurements, and then we send that off for genetic analysis of the samples to try to see if that fungus is present or absent on snakes that look either perfectly healthy or appear to be kind of sick. There is reason to believe that this particular fungus is already in Virginia. And a recent review that this is new information that's just come out, like even in the last month, of preserved museum specimens indicates that this particular fungus has been in the United States at least since the 70s, which is good news. It means it may be a background fungus, maybe not a new fungus that our native snake populations are totally naive to. So there's a good chance that we're not going to lose a bunch of amazing snakes to a nasty fungus that's been introduced from somewhere else. This particular picture is a picture of an eastern indigo snake. It is a beautiful snake most of the time. They can get like 10 feet long. They're so black that when they shine in the sun, they're almost purple. And they're found in longleaf pine habitat down in Georgia, Florida, I want to say Mississippi and Alabama. It's a lovely snake. That particular one is super sick with snake fungal disease. So salt marsh skipper research. The salt marsh skipper is a salt marsh obligate butterfly. It's itty bitty, like it's about like that big, maybe less than an inch. It is dependent, as far as we know, on Spartina alterniflora and Disticulus for egg laying. And then it also needs, the regular pollinator plants in the marsh ecosystem for nectar. So we're trying to figure out, how does habitat fragmentation influence the movement of a native butterfly that needs this ecosystem? Sea level rise again, it's shrinking those marsh habitats, and the construction of roads and homes in the past and in the present, it's making that available pristine salt marsh habitat more and more fragmented. So when you have a small butterfly that can't fly that far, what happens to it? What happens to its population structure, or the amount of diversity between and among populations of that species in response to fragmentation? The particular butterfly we're looking at is really, really common, but we would assume that, it can kind of serve as a stand-in for less common species that are also dependent on that ecosystem. Insects are one of the least well-studied taxa of life on Earth, but they are essential to life on Earth. So I'm really glad to be able to give access to the base for the College of William and Mary team that's checking out what's going on with these butterflies. We have had some novel observations of egg laying for this particular species already come out of this research, so it may not be as picky about which grass species it lays eggs on as we initially thought. And we have found that the insect, particularly the butterfly and moth diversity on Langley, it's one of the highest in the state, probably because these marshes have never been developed specifically because Langley Air Force Base was there. So leaving the research area and going back into natural resource management, and one of my tasks is to advise to prevent conflict between natural resources and the military mission. One of the biggest ways that I have to weigh in on that on a regular basis is trying to look at where are wetlands and minimize conflicts between where we're trying to develop, or if we need to obtain permits for the removal of wetlands to help obtain those permits. I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit more in a minute about when we would need to remove wetlands and why we do that, and then how we mitigate for it. So this picture over on the right of your screen is showing the difference between our 2013 wetland delineation that was done by the Corps of Engineers, and then what they found when they came back in 2019 to do it again. You can see there's a pretty significant expansion of wetlands just in that one park. So one of the things I was able to see on the ground before we got that renewed wetland delineation is just the shifts that are happening on the land. The land always has a story to tell if you know how to read it and pay attention to it. So at this particular park, before it was even officially called a wetland, I was able to see the shifts in the soil coloration. I was able to see the shifts in the plants. I was able to see the shifts in the amount of just standing water that was present on a regular basis. And even before we had a renewed delineation, we were able to say, this area here, we're never going to develop again. We're going to start to retreat, and we've done that in a couple of spots on the base, even before we necessarily were officially told we couldn't without permits, because we can see what's going on the ground. Also carefully review every single set of construction plans that is created for the base once it's in the final stage and in the initial stages, to try to make sure, for example, that the landscaping plans aren't in conflict with our mission. So say you have a new hangar that's being constructed right by the airfield, and they want to put some trees around that hangar to provide some shade. Trees are cool, shade is great, but we don't want to put trees right next to an airfield that are going to attract birds, because we don't want birds in a place that it's not safe for them to be. We also have to make sure that any kind of trees or landscaping that we put on the base is really tolerant to saline conditions. The salt spray coming out of the back river has a more profound effect than one might think. I have survey devices and survey equipment that's probably 1.5 kilometers away from the coast. It's got calcium deposits on it from salt spray that's coming off that water. So any plant that we put on base, it needs to be tough, it needs to not be invasive, It needs to not attract wildlife where it's not safe for wildlife to be. And then I also have a big role to play on the BASH team. And BASH is an acronym that we use that stands for Bird Aircraft Strike Hazard. And I'm going to get more into discussing our BASH program with you guys in the next slide. So BASH is a huge issue around an airfield, particularly an airfield with military aircraft that are worth, I want to say our total aircraft fleet was worth $6.7 billion the last time I checked. I'm sure it's worth more than that now. Since 1995, more than $1 billion has been spent on the repair specifically of military aircraft due to wildlife strikes. 13 aircraft have been completely destroyed. 27 service members have been killed. And anytime you hit a bird or an animal with a plane, it's generally fatal for the wildlife. So, BASH is bad all around, and we do everything we can to prevent it. On the civilian side of the house, more than $1 billion gets spent a year repairing damage to American planes from conflicts with wildlife. The Air Force has an entire department dedicated to policy related to BASH, and they come out and provide advisory services to help us improve. Their website's listed there in case you're interested. It's actually pretty interesting information. It's run by biologists. And so, bringing everybody's attention back to the BASH issue, I think most of you probably heard about the miracle on the Hudson. That was the most famous BASH incident that I'm aware of in the United States, where, a plane, it took off, it hit a flock of geese, the geese were sucked into the engine, both engines on the aircraft failed, and the plane had to make an emergency landing in water. Fortunately, nobody was killed there, but it doesn't always go that way, except for the geese. The geese were killed. So every Air Force installation, like I said, with an airfield, has a team of both U.S. Air Force biologists. That's me. I'm an Air Force biologist. Sometimes they're actually active duty military folks. And then we also hire wildlife biologists with the United States Department of Agriculture. And, their whole job is to just scare away wildlife day after day, try to manage the airfield to keep wildlife away from it every single day. Consideration of avian hazard risk is taken into account at every Air Force installation ahead of our flight operations, because, and another reason that it's important to try to minimize wildlife on an airfield, airports are known genetic sinks for wildlife. And a genetic sink is a place where genes are lost. When individuals in a population that's already not doing well get on an airfield and get hit by a plane, it's a big loss, and it needs to be avoided to the maximum extent possible. Being where we are in Hampton Roads, right next to a lot of beautiful tidal marshes, a lot of shorebirds, important shorebirds like dunlin, willets, they pass through our installation, and we do what we can, to keep them safe. So you can kind of think of birds on an airfield the same way you would think of children playing in the road in traffic. It's just not good. It's not going to go well. The most likely time for a BASH event to occur is during takeoff or landing, which makes sense. Planes aren't at a super high altitude at that point. They're just coming up off the ground, and those lower altitudes are the most likely place for birds or vertebrate, like large vertebrates like coyotes and deer. It's the most likely place for them to be. It's closer to the ground. Some of the things we do, particularly on Langley, to reduce the probability of having wildlife on our airfield is that we've put up fences. We have coyote get on the airfield pretty regularly. Fox are frequently out there. Coyote are probably the biggest one lately because they are wily. They get that name for a reason. White-tailed deer get on the airfield somewhat routinely. We've managed to get that more under control in the last few years. Other things, so we put up fences to kind of stop, some of those guys from coming on the airfield, or have fewer areas where we have to patrol to scare them away. We also prevent early successional habitat through mowing and through, just habitat management. You don't want cover and you don't want food if you're trying to keep animals away. You don't want water, food, or cover, because those are the basic things that any species is looking for in order to survive. On the airfield itself, we keep the grass pretty low. But in the areas surrounding the airfield where we don't mow as frequently, we try to maintain a grass height between 10 and 24 inches in order to interfere with interflock communication. Like if you're a big flock of shorebirds, you don't want to be in tall grass where a coyote or some other predator can just, take you out. We reduce the presence of fruiting plants on the airfield and around the airfield, for the same reason I just discussed. We don't want to give them that food. And we also try to make sure that we have really good grass coverage. We don't want any bare spaces because those will attract particularly like grackles, blackbirds, and any kind of bird that's seeking grit for digestion. The grass seed that we do also put on the airfield, it's high endophyte fescue, which means it's grass seed that's been intentionally infected with a symbiotic fungi. Makes it taste terrible and birds don't like it as much. And then again, like I said, we remove water and wetlands to the extent that we can on our airfield, because you don't want to create like a wet marsh habitat to attract shorebirds to a place it's not safe for them to be. It's not good for the birds, and it's not good for the aircraft, and it makes the airfield more prone to flooding and less resilient to storms. To date, we've removed about 36 acres of wetlands off of the airfield. These were not high quality, pristine wetlands. These were mowed, wet ditches primarily that were contributing to the death of dunlin and willet, and other important species that we care about. It made sense to remove them. And we removed them, we paid into the Virginia Aquatic Resource Trust Fund to construct wetlands in places where it was appropriate and where they're primarily targeting the construction of migratory corridors for wildlife. So it makes a lot more sense to put them somewhere else where it's going to allow wildlife to move safely. Again, I like to say, preventing collisions is in the best interest of wildlife because they do not survive it. Other things that we do to mitigate the hazards of wildlife on the airfield at Langley are research. Again, like good, sound biological management of a particular species or a suite of species, it's driven by evidence and it's driven by science, not just what somebody thinks is probably a good idea. To that end, back in 2017, I commissioned a project where we looked at weather data and then data on bash events and then also on wildlife surveys. So we could try to say, we know that we get huge flocks of shorebirds on the airfield anytime there's a big storm that's caused the Chesapeake Bay to back up. We know that this happens, like we're seeing that it happens, but we don't have data so that we can tell pilots and so that we can tell our safety officers, the weather is this way on this particular day, you're at an increased risk of hitting a bird because like the tide cycles have backed up the water, Plum Island's flooded and the birds have come over here to hunker down. We were able to tie down data that we were already collecting as part of our BASH program, correlate that with weather data from a 20-year period, and then come up with a model that says, hey, you get more shorebirds on your airfield when the wind, the temperature, and the tide are at a particular height. So now as part of our bird watch conditions, which is, where we say, hey, it's too dangerous to fly, there's too many birds, it's safe to fly, there's not so many birds. Our bird watch conditions is what we call that decision. As part of our bird watch conditions, we say, well, what's the weather like today? What's the probability that we're going to have a bunch of shorebirds hunkering down and that we might have a serious impact if we choose to fly? And we actually do alter our flight behavior based on those bird watch conditions. If there's a lot of birds around, if it's real dangerous, if there's, especially large birds or just a huge flock of birds, we don't fly for a little while because we don't want to cause that damage to aircraft. We want to put, pilots in danger like that. Other things that we do, we haze birds away. I'll talk to you a little bit more about how we do that particularly. And again, like I said, we alter our flight behavior. During peak migration periods, like what we're going through right now, we actually don't fly from an hour before or an hour after sunrise and an hour before sunset because we know that there's a lot more birds moving in that time. So we just don't do it because we know it's dangerous. So we do a lot to try to, prevent it, which, telling a pilot you can't fly because there's birds on the airfield, like it takes a lot of convincing, but we do a good job of it. So hazing, I thought that, bird folks might be interested in how we do that. We have what's called bash cannons. They don't shoot anything. We just call them that because they're really loud. These can be remote operated, or they can be put on a timer to go off once an hour, and they're in various spots on the airfield. Basically, they just make big scary noises at random times, or if we see like a bunch of birds in a particular spot, we can push a button on a remote and scare the birds off ahead of flight operations, so we get them on out of there. We also play recorded distress calls. So it's like a remix of every sound that sounds scary to birds. I think there's like a red-tailed hawk that sounds like it's dying. There's like some mockingbirds. There's a couple other it's just a remix of random calls that signal danger. And it works pretty well for a little while. Any one technique is not enough for scaring birds away because they are intelligent animals and they quickly habituate to anything that you're doing. We use flare guns. Those work great with crows because they're smart. You can shoot a flare gun. You don't hit the crow with it. If the crow's here, you shoot the flare like in this direction, but it goes by them enough that they're like, that's scary, and they fly off. For some of the more stubborn animals like eagles, sometimes we have to physically get out and run after them. Like a biologist is out on the airfield saying, hey, I'm a scary predator, get out of here, and they fly off. Nest removal is done. If there's like big nests right near the airfield, we do remove those before birds can hatch because it's not safe for them. They'd be better off to try again somewhere else. And some bases, they use dogs to do the same thing that, on our base, we're having to use, humans to do, where we're going to chase them away. Some installations will use high-powered green lasers. I've also heard of sound devices that send like a sound wave frequency that we can't hear towards the birds. It's pretty effective. We don't do that on Langley because there's not enough, we don't know enough about them yet. We're still waiting on a lot of that research to come out. So the bottom line as far as hazing though, is that we constantly have to change what we're doing. Animals are intelligent, they learn quickly. If a scarecrow's up in the same spot for 2 days, they know it's not real. So it just takes, a whole suite of methods, and it takes persistence, and it takes somebody being on the airfield at all times when we have flight operations going on to try to prevent, wildlife impacts between planes and animals. So when a bash event does happen, despite all of our best efforts, what do? It does happen sometimes, like no matter what we do, unless we put ourselves in a bubble from which we wouldn't be able to operate aircraft, birds are going to come in. So when a bash event does happen, it triggers like a small scale investigation depending on the extent of the mishap. The aircraft, or USDA person or flight crew will go out and they'll take remains, or what they call snarge, which is just it's feathers, it's tissue, it's whatever is left of the individual animal. They're collected and then they're sent to the Smithsonian for species identification. If there are not enough feathers left for them to identify it using, the feathers present in the sample, they will actually do genetic analysis to determine what species it is and then let us know later on down the line, so we can keep that for our records and try to figure out, if it's all mourning doves, maybe we need to make sure, we've got more grit on the air, or more grass on the airfield. If it's all, rock pigeons, where are they coming from? And then we do an investigation to try to figure out, well, what could we have done to avoid this? How can we constantly improve our program? If it's a really serious mishap, which has happened before, where it's more than $2 million in damage, or human life has been put at risk, or human life has been lost, it triggers an investigation from the Air Force Safety Center, so they can come to the base and try to figure out, how can you make your program better? How can you do a better job of getting that wildlife off of the airfield? And all of these pictures, the one on the left is of a huge flock of starling. They're a constant challenge. The one in the center, it's not at Langley, it's at a municipal airport. Those are all rock doves or rock pigeons on the airfield that were hit by a plane. And the one on the right is individual specimens that are in the Smithsonian reference collection for how they help to support with identification of any birds that are sent to them. All right, moving on from bash into invasive species management. One of the big species that we struggle with on Langley is Phragmites. Phragmites is that tall grass that's in the marsh. We actually treated it using a small helicopter yesterday. We sprayed it with herbicide primarily from the air. It has a lot less of an impact when we do it like that. We've also recently been working, we have a rookery of 60 to 80 nests of heron and anhinga and egrets over at Bethel Reservoir. We removed a lot of English ivy and other girdling vines to try to make sure that the available nest trees over there stay as strong and as abundant as they can for as long as possible. Recently, we've discovered emerald ash borer and the pumpkin ash that are around Big Bethel Reservoir. That started moving into the area in 2020, probably from firewood coming out of Newport News Park. We treated some of the pumpkin ash on our property because it's an unusual species. They have a real disjunct distribution. They're huge, and we have like the 4 largest in the state. So it's at a huge risk, that particular species of ash tree, from extinction from emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer kills more than 90% of ash trees infected with it within 5 years. And we have little small pockets of unusual species that are separated from one another, and then they're under threat from an invasive species. They're at a high risk for extinction. I want to say the IUCN said that within 20 years, there's like an 80% chance they'll go extinct without help. So we banked a lot of the seeds from pumpkin ash on that site. We sent them down to the National USDA Seed Conservation Vault down in Georgia. And then we've got a long-term in situ population on site that we're protecting with internally applied insecticide. We don't want to do that to all the trees out there, because they're part of the food web. We don't want to make the food web poisonous to other species that need them. But we do want to preserve the genes that are present in that site for future restoration efforts. And I think I've got enough time to get through this. Some of the extra things that we do, that we're not necessarily required to do, but we can. And so we try to do as much as possible. We're a Tree City, USA, and we have been for 22 years now. That means that we spend money to preserve the trees that we have. We plant trees every year, and we have an Arbor Day celebration. I develop tree care plans on the base internally so we can identify what trees look dead. We need to get those down before the next big storm so they don't stop traffic. What trees just need a little bit of care so that they can live, and draw up water, protect us from flooding, give us shade, cool us down for as long as possible. I develop those plans in-house and then work with engineering to execute them each year. We're also converting a good bit of our golf course, just, regular old greens, to pollinator habitat. It's far enough away from the airfield, so there's not necessarily a conflict there. We restored, I want to say, 12 acres. It's right next to the marsh. So, for some of those insect species that are there, but we may not know about, it may be a big help to them. And then we support outdoor recreation. We do the bird counts in the spring and winter with you guys. It's a huge help, both from a biological perspective, and I personally think it's fun. We have a nature trail that we have a guided plant walk on it. We're developing educational signs for our shoreline restoration projects so that more people in the area that live and work on Langley can understand, why does our shoreline look like this? Why is this a better method of erosion control than other methods? And maybe if they have an eroding shoreline on their own property, maybe that's an approach they can take rather than trying to do something like a seawall that's going to cause erosion downstream. Mark Sopko and Bill Bay led our nest box effort this year. This picture in this particular slide is one that Bill took of a brave mother bluebird that didn't want to get off of her eggs because she's a good mama. And that contributes to citizen science. And then we had a recent confirmation of prothanotary warbler at Big Bethel Reservoir. I want to say the coal stalks are the ones that documented that. They were working on a contract through the University of Montana, and it was one of those baseline biological surveys I was talking about. They were found through eBird. So if you ever wonder if anybody's looking at all your cool eBird observations, people do. I don't know what we're going to do about that, but I'm pretty open to putting in more nest boxes and maybe developing a trail out there so that people can enjoy that beautiful bird. They're such a treat to see. And with that, I think that is the end of my presentation. I think we've got a couple minutes for for questions. I'm going to try to get into the chat so I can see those.
Does anyone have any questions this evening?
This is Harry Colstock. Quick question on Big Bethel Reservoir and its future. There was some question whether or not they were going to take down the dam there. Is that not the case, or does anybody know at this point?
It's possible. So the lower Big Bethel Dam is the first impediment to fish passage out of the Chesapeake Bay. And one of the goals of the Chesapeake Bay program that the DoD is involved in is restoring fish passage. That's harder to say than it sounds like. Another concern with that dam is that it's in bad shape as far as like its structural integrity. So, you know, we recently took some core samples in order to try to figure out what's the sediment that this dam is built on, how structurally stable is it. The most likely scenario I can see right now is that we may remove the upper dam and decrease the overall size of the lower dam, which will open up a lot of edge habitat that may also support, you know, more of those cool marsh species. You know, it used to be that dam is built on the Bethel Scarp, which is a natural geological formation. So there was always kind of an area that held water there. And if we can open back up some of that wetland habitat, you know, that might be a win for the environment and for the, you know, the integrity of that lower dam. So I guess the answer is we don't know yet. We're still trying to figure it out.
I was curious about,
I'd like to thank Alicia for supporting the bird count, both spring and Christmas. Not only does she participate, but she coordinates with security to make sure we don't get taken down when we go to some of the prohibited areas on the base. So I appreciate that help.
It's my pleasure. I appreciate, you know, without the Hampton Roads Bird Club, I couldn't do the bird count. There is a wealth of knowledge in this organization that I, as one individual, cannot match. You know, I know a little bit about a lot of things, but I don't know as much about birds as any of you probably, though I do try.
There's a question in the chat, and the question is there any place in the reservoir open to walking?
So right now, not really. It's a huge parcel of property that we have, but that, you know, it used to protect a drinking water plant that was the drinking water source for Fort Monroe and for Langley. There is the Langley Family Camp, which if you're DOD or ever been DOD or a veteran or a retiree, you can go over there. Honestly, even if you're not, nobody's really going to check. So you can go to the fam camp and there's some edge habitat around the marsh or around the lake that you might be able to see some of those birds. You'd have to ask the Colstocks specifically where they found them at. You know, and if enough people are interested, maybe I can organize a walk for all of you. So
something we've started to see recently coming out of Plumtree was short-eared owls. And certainly the times that I've seen them, it appears that they're coming out of the Plumtree in the evening and making a beeline for the base. And I was curious if that was something that y'all had been observing.
I believe that they've come over into the munition storage area, which is like on the back part of the base up near the marshes on a couple of occasions. If you want to check on December 18th, you can join us for the Christmas bird count. Maybe if we go back there early, we could see a couple.
Well, if weather permits, I'm going to try to have my boat out around Plumtree because that's an area we don't get covered as basically at all inside the circle, provided it's nice and calm.
Alicia, I was just curious if you looked at any pollinator stuff on the base, because I know that's a big hot topic with everyone. right now, and pollinator corridors, and Hampton being a bee city and things of that nature.
Yeah, where it's not, the majority of the base, like the physical space on the base is taken up by the airfield. So I don't want to put any pollinator habitat near the airfield itself, because again, we don't want to draw birds into an area where it's not safe for them to be. But on the golf course, which is an old bombing range, like I said, we've converted about, I want to say it's either 8 or 10 acres at this point, just from like greens, grasses to mixed native wildflowers, so where we can. But that's pretty much the extent of our, implementation of the like Air Force pollinator conservation strategy. Is that where we can, move something from, highly maintained grasses to wildflower habitat, we'll do that where it makes sense.
Okay, I was just curious. Thank you.
No
Are
problem.
there any other questions for this evening before we all say adieu? Well, hearing none, thank you very much. That was a nice insight of what's going on. Didn't know all that stuff, so that's kind of cool. Thank you for speaking to our group, and thank everyone for attending. Hopefully we see each other in the field, and I wish you a good evening. And bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you all so much.